Well, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Jim Chalmers, who is the federal member for Rankin. We are in the seat of Rankin right now. Jim is also the Shadow Minister for Finance. And a bit of bio on Jim. Jim has been the member for Rankin since September 2013, proudly representing the people of suburbs of southern Brisbane and Logan City, where he was born, grew up and made a home with Laura, Leo and Annabelle, which he uses when he gets a slow day on Facebook. He puts his kids up and then Facebook goes crazy because they're the cutest kids in the world. He was elected to his second term in July 2016, except my own kids, of course, with an increased margin, and was subsequently appointed as Shadow Minister of Finance, entering the Shadow Cabinet for the first time. Before being elected to Parliament, Jim was Executive Director of the Chiefly Research Centre. Prior to that, Chief of Staff to the Deputy Prime Minister and Treasurer. He has had a PhD in Political Science, International Relations, and a first-class honours degree in Public Policy. He has taught politics in 3 universities. Jim is also a member of the Griffith University Logan Campus Development Advisory Group and Board of Advisors at the Centre for Australia, New Zealand and Pacific Studies at Georgetown University, Washington, DC. But more importantly, he is our federal member, and I have to say, one of the best federal members we have ever had representing us in Canberra. Please make Phil welcome to the stage, Jim Chalmers.
Thanks very much, Luke. That was a much kinder introduction than I got from Bob Clark, who was here a moment ago and said to me, "How did you get an invite here?" And I got to tell you, when I look at the agenda and some of the quality of some of the other speakers, I can kind of see what Bob means. And before we go any further, Russell Lutton and John Raven, when they rocked up, they said they wanted to sit there so that they'd be in my eyesight so that they could heckle me. So these are the kind of challenges that you have to put up with here as the federal member for Rankin. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Yugambeh and the Yagara people, their elders and traditions. Pay my respects to all of the first Australians. This is a great place to meet. I grew up about 30 seconds from here in Springwood, so it's always terrific to see this part of our great city utilised for purposes like these, where we really try and look forward into the future. I want to acknowledge my state colleagues who were here earlier today. I want to acknowledge all of the councillors from the best council on the planet, Logan, but also from the other councils right around Queensland. People like Rachel, who I've met before. I know that there are mayors and councillors from all over the place. I also wanted to acknowledge Jane and all of the team from Logan City Council. I probably go to 4 or 5 Logan City Council events each week, and they're always very professionally run. They're always terrific events to take part in. So I wanted to acknowledge the work that they all do as well as the other presenters and all of you who are here today. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to speak to you today. When Luke invited me, I said yes in about 3 seconds because for a couple of reasons, really. Partly because of how important these sorts of issues that you're discussing today are, but also in terms of the timing. My job is largely in Canberra about the federal budget. We had the budget handed down last week, so this is a good opportunity to get my head out of some of that stuff and into some of the big future issues. But also because it gives me an opportunity to shamelessly plug a book that I've got coming out in September, which is about technology, it's about the future of work, and it's how we find a place for people like the people that we represent here in the economy of the future. And I want to talk a little bit about that book in a moment. When I look at the rest of the agenda that you've been through today, and I know that there's more coming up tomorrow, some really terrific speakers from overseas and from closer to home. And what I really appreciate and what I really wanted to acknowledge about the agenda is just how positive people are about the opportunities that technological change brings to our community and to the country more broadly. And I share that optimism, I share that enthusiasm, I share that excitement, and I celebrate with you the opportunities that technology will bring. And I think it's highly appropriate for a council like ours to focus on things like service delivery and to focus on things like how we make our city and other cities work more effectively. I see technology as a really important way to improve lives, to enhance well-being, to save time and effort, to make our jobs easier and safer, to boost productivity, to help overcome obstacles to a good life, and including and especially in our cities. But what I wanted to do today was to give a slightly different perspective, partly from a national policy point of view. I wanted to give that perspective. But I also wanted to talk about people who might see technological change in a slightly different way than many of you do here in this room today, and the position that I just described, an optimistic position that I just described. And I want to encourage and implore you to think about, as you go through the agenda today and tomorrow, I want to encourage you to think about how we distribute the opportunities of the new machine age. You know, how we make sure that technology is a force for good for more people and not just a few of us, and how we make sure that technology is not just another thing which widens the inequalities in our society and in our country. And I know that's a little bit different to some of the other presentations, but I think it's really important. And so I thought my best contribution today would be to talk about that. Because we shouldn't dismiss the very real concerns that a lot of people outside of these walls, in Springwood, throughout Logan, throughout Australia, the concerns that people have about technological change, and particularly in the workplace, which is the topic of my book and the topic of what I wanted to talk about today. Because a lot of people are not just concerned about where they might fit in the workplace of the future, they're concerned about whether they fit in the workforce of the future. And we need to spend as much time thinking about them as we think about grasping some of these important service delivery and other opportunities as well. I think it's possible to simultaneously celebrate the upside of technology while working, in my case, at the federal level, but at all levels, to ensure that we have the policies that mean more people can take advantage of the change in our society and in our economy. A couple of Fridays ago, I was in a taxi and there was a guy called Dave was driving, and we got talking. And when you're a politician, you're always wary about striking up a conversation with a cabbie, or at least you're worried about admitting that you're a politician when you talk to a cabbie. But we had this terrific conversation about his journey to that point. He was probably in his late 40s or early 50s, Dave. And he had a story which is central to the types of things that concern me in this topic that we're talking about today. David spent 13 years as a truck driver in the mines. And then, of course, a lot of the ways that they transport minerals now are automated. So he lost his job after 13 years in the mines. He then got a job as an assembly worker at a factory where 80 people got replaced by 6 people. Or 80 people, a workforce of 80 people became a workforce of 6 people, effectively maintaining the machines. And for a lot of businesses, automation is something that they want to see make them more productive, more efficient. But for people like Dave, he'd been through a journey where technology was not the exciting thing that many of us here see it as. And so these sorts of things that I'm talking about today, or that I'm about to talk to today, the distribution of opportunity in the new machine age, these matter very deeply to people in our community. And we need to work out what we do at a national level and at all levels to make sure that people aren't left behind. That's why it matters to me. I think this is probably the most important issue that I'll grapple with in my time in the Parliament, the impact of automation and machines, robotics, artificial learning, all of these things on the workforce. I think that will be the dominant change in my political lifetime, however long that is. And I'm really pleased again to see that it matters to the Council as well and to all of you. So the book that I've written is co-authored with a guy called Mike Quigley. Some of you might have heard of Mike. He used to be the CEO of the National Broadband Network. And Mike's an outstanding guy. He's had a 40-year career in technology. And what we've done is we've gotten together to write a book so that he can, so that together between the political side and the technological side, we can try and suggest some ways forward in our communities. And I want to give a bit of a preview of that book today. It comes out in September, just in time for Christmas. If you haven't.
How much is it?
How much is it? It's about $25 in the first week, but if you wait a week or so, it'll be much cheaper. Now, the premise of my book is that technology will produce gains, but we need to care about how those gains are distributed. And it starts with reference to a really amazing American economist called Tyler Cowen. And when I read this warning from Tyler Cowen a couple of years ago, it really struck home to me, which is we need to avoid all of our communities becoming divided into 2 camps. One camp of people who can work with machines, and the other camp of people who are replaced by them. And I think it's a pretty simple thing. It's not rocket science, but that is the sort of warning that rattles around in my head when I think about the sorts of challenges that we are up against. And we need to avoid bursts of technology creating bursts of inequality. And that has national relevance and it has relevance here in this community. And I think there are three policy ways you can deal with technology, and I'm about to make the only partisan political point that I'll make all day, but there are really three ways that you can deal with these bursts of technology. The first crowd says, let it rip, whatever will be, technology is good, whatever the consequences. And that's the sort of approach that I think led to Malcolm Turnbull talk about what an exciting time to be alive, when a lot of people heard that and thought, well, where do I fit in this exciting time of the future? The second camp is probably the sort of the Hansen camp, which says that we can hold back technological change. We can prevent it happening. We can turn back to the clock to a time when everybody had a secure job for life, where jobs weren't automated. And that is unrealistic, of course, but it also robs us of the gains of technology as well. And the third approach is the approach that we take in our book, which is about meaningful interventions to try and ensure that change works for most people or more people and not against them. And in the broad historical sweep of the sorts of things that we're talking about here, this is really the sixth enormous revolution in the way that we live and work that we're going through now when it comes to robotics and machine learning and automation. Now, the first one, 12,000 years ago, was the first agricultural revolution. Then we had the scientific revolution in the 1500s. We had the British agricultural revolution around the mid-17th century. We had the Industrial Revolution, arguably the most important one at the beginning of the 18th century. We had the digital revolution, computers and the internet, in the 20th century, and still in the tail end of that now. And now we have what people have come to call the new machine age, which is robotics, machine learning, automation, artificial intelligence. And what all of those big revolutions have, and I know that I'm being, this is a helicopter view, a simplistic view of how things have changed. But each of those revolutions have greatly changed the way that we work. They've all increased aggregate living standards, but with consequences for people left behind. The key was how we transitioned from one to the other, one way of doing things to the other, and that there's a role for government to smooth those transitions. And for that reason, I think we need to think ahead about these issues that we're talking about today. Now, a lot of you would have read a lot of the literature, a lot of the analysis. There's heaps of analysis now which tries to predict what will happen to the workforce in the 10 or 20 years ahead. And a lot of you here being technologists would have read Frey and Osborne and others, which have tried in the US, the UK, and in terms of CEDA here in Australia, tried to work out how many jobs will be lost and created and changed by some of the technological changes that we're talking about today. And despite everyone's best efforts and despite all of this effort that goes into it, there's really no consensus about the amount of jobs displaced, the amount of jobs created, the amount of jobs changed. And some of the estimates vary really widely and wildly. So Frey and Osborne and CEDA, they talk about somewhere between 40 and 47% of jobs lost over the next 10 or 15 years, which is a pretty extraordinary number. But the OECD says something a bit more like 9%. And so that gives you a bit of a sense of the range of people's predictions. So there's no agreement on that, but there is some agreement on the underpinnings of that change. Firstly, obviously, there's already been enormous impacts of technology on manual jobs, and we've already seen a lot of that. A lot of our families would have been impacted by those sorts of changes. They're not necessarily new. But what is new is that a lot of this technological change is moving up into the professions, moving up into what some people might crudely call middle-class jobs, middle-income jobs. And we're seeing more and more technology displacing those jobs as well. Some jobs are changing for the better. They're becoming safer, more productive. Others are being pushed out of reach of a lot of people, of a lot of the sort of people that I represent here in Rankin. So the safest assumption amidst all of this uncertainty about the exact numbers, the exact magnitude of the change, the safest assumption is that all jobs will change in some way. Some jobs will be augmented, a lot of jobs will be lost, and some jobs will be created as well. So what we need to do is we need to anticipate and act on those things that we're sure about, and we also need no regrets policies, policies which, if we put in place in the next 5 or 10 years, then we know that they'll bring societal benefit. Now, what worries us a lot about this change is that we already have in this country 75-year highs in inequality, worse in the US, worse in the UK, granted, but we do already have deep concerns about our society becoming less equal. And less equal societies obviously invite all kinds of other societal problems. And the concern is, when it comes to technology specifically, is that if technology, left unchecked, technology has the capacity to widen inequality in our society. It also has the possibility to improve people's lives, improve service delivery for people who are disadvantaged. But in terms of the workplace and in terms of the distribution of income, there's a lot for us to be worried about. This sort of technology that I'm talking about today, it changes the composition of the workforce. It pushes people who might traditionally be in middle income roles down into the lower income stratas. It changes the location of jobs because of labour linking and other forces, which mean that a lot of the value chain might not be done locally, it might be done in other cheaper labour markets with more access to robotics. It changes the skills that people need to succeed in the economy and in the workplace. And it also further changes the power relationship at work as we have more and more of the gig economy or casualisation, less secure work. That has implications for the wages outcomes that people can bargain for themselves. And that's why we care about. Because it has the capacity for a lot of people to hurt people's living standards, then we care about that very deeply. Now, the main point when it gets to the recommendations of the book that we've written is that we are kidding ourselves at the political level if we think that we can just sort of observe these big technological changes happening in our workforce and think that governments don't have to change as well. And I think if we're frank about it and brutal about it, there probably is a bit of that in Canberra, this sense that we will always find a way to muddle through. You know, that we can admire and celebrate or even be concerned about technological change in our workplaces without fundamentally rethinking how we do government as well, locally, state level, but in my case, at the national level as well. And the book makes 36 different policy recommendations. I won't go through all of them here today, and Russell and John have breathed a sigh of relief at that news. But just to give you a sense of the kind of things that we will be recommending and that we'd be happy to talk with people about either in the brief Q&A after I finish or at some other opportunity, because these are the sorts of policy categories that we think we need to deal with. Firstly, of course, our schools need to change. Our schools need to change dramatically, whether it's the number and quality of our STEM teachers. I think I saw Stacey here, she might still be here. She's really the gold standard of STEM teachers in our community. We need lots of them, people like Stacey. We need to think about things like flipped learning. Flipped learning is where the teacher is at the back of the room rather than the front. The lessons get delivered at home by video and then the help and the homework gets done in the school hours. That's what flipped learning is. We need to think about that. Curriculum change so that we're teaching computational thinking. Genuine needs-based funding for kids who are left behind, and early intervention into families that we know will struggle, and that we know if there's not that early intervention, then people will have trouble through the education pathway and into work. Our social security system needs to change. We need to modernise the safety net. We need to use data for good and not just for punitive purposes. We need to focus on carers and caring services. We need to use technology to liberate workers with a disability. We need to rewrite what reciprocal obligation means in the machine age. We need to think about things like income smoothing when people's work patterns are much less regular and their wages are much less regular. We need to rethink our labour market programs to stop thinking about trying to fit one person in one job into an identical job in another position. We need to think about skills matching within labour market programs and not just job matching or job title matching, which is what we do a lot of now. We need a genuine emphasis on lifelong learning, which recognises that jobs turn over far more frequently. There is no such thing, unless you're Russell, of a job for life. There's no such thing. Russell threw the first punch. That's why I keep going back to Russell. But there's no such, on a serious note, there's no such thing as a job for life anymore. The idea that you finish school, you do a bit of training, and then you work in the same industry in the same job for the rest of your life, that's gone now. The average length that a worker stays in a job now is 3.3 years. 3.3 years, and that's a pretty extraordinary number. A high school leaver today will have on average 17 different employers and 5 completely different careers in their lifetime. So that's a pretty extraordinary thing, and that puts the onus on us to think about lifelong learning, granular on-the-job retraining more regularly. We need to think about how people fund that retraining, whether we can fix the rorts in income contingent loans, for example, so that we can have a system where people can pay back their training costs as they earn more and move up the income scale. All of these kinds of things are very important. Matched learning accounts, so people can save for their own re-education and education with help from the government. We need to think about all of these kinds of things. In the industrial relations system, we need to be very careful about conditions being stripped away. We need to make sure that we still have the capacity to make sure that people aren't being taken advantage of in the industrial relations system. Airtasker in New South Wales has just done this terrific deal with the New South Wales unions, for example, about protecting some basic conditions for people who do jobs via Airtasker. We need to have another look at things like employee share schemes, things like worker representation on boards, all of these sorts of things. In tax, we need to work out how we tax capital. We need to think about things like what Bill Gates has proposed, the robot tax. We need to think about all kinds of ways that we raise the money that's necessary to provide the services that people expect and deserve. We need to think about how we measure economic activity. As things change in our economy, the old measures of GDP are becoming less and less relevant, less and less accurate. We need to properly measure activity in communities like this. We need to design markets for information so that it's not just the people who benefit from that information who are remunerated for it. And we obviously need, and I know the council is with us on this, we need universal access to fast broadband. And if we don't have that, then a lot of the other things that we're talking about are harder to achieve. So we need our schools to change. We need our government policies to change across all of those areas that I've just mentioned. But we also need a change in personal mindset. And not just people like yourselves who grasp these opportunities very easily, but more broadly throughout the community. We need people to think about technology differently. And that means having a different approach to self-education. It means having a different approach to mentoring and things like that. It means that we need different approaches to community attitudes to maths and the sciences. We need to get more women involved in maths and science in our schools and beyond. All of these sorts of things require a dramatically different personal mindset if technology is going to be a force for good and not just something that we need to be concerned about. So those are some of the ideas that I had. People have had, as we've moved around the country writing this book, people have had a range of ideas, and no doubt there will be more here from some of you from your different perspectives. Our main point really is that we need to start thinking about these things now. We need to make this technological revolution work for people, not against them. We need to make sure that technological change is good for all of us and not just for some of us. There's lots of opportunity in technological change, but there's lots of anxiety as well. And so in that light, I want to say how much I appreciate again having the opportunity to lay out some of these ideas. I hope I haven't been too much of a downer, but really just trying to reflect the concern in the community so that we can think about those things at the same time as we think about the big service delivery in cities and other opportunities of this whole agenda that we're talking about over the next 2 days. So in that context, I look forward to any questions or suggestions or feedback or anything really at all. Thanks very much for listening. G'day. All right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We had one right here.
Yeah, I have a question about technology disrupting.
The mic's coming to you, mate. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Ricardo Tonali. I'm from a company called Thinkstro.
Hey, Ricardo.
You actually gave me a new perspective on the jobs that are being lost, and I didn't realise exactly in those words how it's impacting middle-class workers. In that vein, do you see technology disrupting government and government positions? Do you see that making government smaller, bigger, the roles that change within government? So just your view on that.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Ricardo. That's a terrific question. It'll definitely make the way government operates change. And the question for us is whether we use that change to do more or we use that change as a reason to make government smaller. And that's really an ideological question at the core of that. In my view, we should be using technology, in the same sort of investment envelope, we should be using technology to have better ways to intervene early in people's lives in the education system or in other ways, We should have the capacity to use technology for things like income smoothing, so that if you're on a government payment but you have the capacity to work every now and again in the gig economy or some other way, then we should have intelligent ways to be able to automatically smooth that income. My fear is that at the moment, at the sort of leading edge of this, technology is used in a punitive way. And so we've had this robo-debt debacle largely, where people have been assumed to be guilty unless proven innocent. And the government says, well, this is how technology works. That's not how technology has to work in government. We should be able to think of ways, and it shouldn't be beyond us to think of ways for technology to be a force for good in the way that we deliver services, in the way that we deliver social security, in the way that I consult the people that I represent, in the way that they have access to their political representatives. In all of these ways, we should see it as an opportunity, big opportunity.
David Wilkes, Jim.
It's good to see you again, David.
Thank you. You didn't touch on universal income,
Yeah.
Which is obviously a major factor in this equation. What we're facing now isn't new, obviously. Toffler wrote about it 40 years ago, and we're simply seeing it come to the surface at this point in time. If it can be automated, if it can be systematised, it can be automated. There's no question of that. So I tend to believe the 40% figure rather than the 9% figure. Is this something that at a governmental level is being considered, universal income?
Thanks very much, David. It's in the conversation. Universal basic income is everybody in this room gets the same payment regardless of the amount of work that you do or the amount of resources that you have personally. We spend 2 or 3 pages in the book talking about universal basic income. I'm not in favour of it, and the reason I'm not in favour of it is I think that one of the best things we have going for us in this country is we have, according to the OECD, the best targeted, most effective welfare system in the world, in the developed world. And you wouldn't get that from reading the front of the Daily Telegraph or the Courier Mail necessarily, but that's the case. And my view is when you've got limited funds, government funds, they should go where they're most needed. But a lot of people, a lot of very serious people around the world have argued that there should be a universal basic income, and that mostly they come from parts of the argument where there are poorly targeted welfare systems, or they come from, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, a lot of these characters who are big serious players obviously in the technological world, arguably the biggest players, and they just see it as the easiest way to deal with people displaced by technology. I don't think it's beyond the Australian political system to have targeted welfare and to have technology that makes that targeting more effective, rather than what I see as really giving up and spraying around money, including to people who don't need it. The other thing, of course, is the cost. And there's a terrific guy at the Australian National University, Peter Whiteford, probably Australia's leading expert on the Australian social security system. And he calculated that marginal tax rates, in order to pay for the sort of universal basic income at the sort of level which is talked about, marginal tax rates would need to be about 80%. So people would need to pay about 80% in effective rates, not marginal, effective rates, in order for the UBI at the level that people are talking about to be possible. So even at the practical level, I think there's an issue with cost. Sure.
Where the reality is there are other alternatives, and that they'll be painful, but taxing wealth, which you've already covered to some degree, taxing robots. We don't need to think in traditional terms when it comes to the taxation system.
I agree we don't need to think in traditional terms, but it doesn't, even if it does, it doesn't assume that we tax things the same way. It assumes that we raise about the same amount of tax. So right now we tax about 25% as a proportion of the economy as tax. And you're right that we assume that people won't cop a dramatic change in either direction. But that doesn't mean within that mix we can't think of other things like taxing robots. Thanks, David. Go for it.
Thanks, Jim. Daniel Fletcher from Central Highlands Regional Council. Your insight's impressive. I don't know if you've considered it, but I'm sort of seeing the next federal treasurer. Just something to
That'll
think
be,
about.
don't tell Chris Bowen you said that.
I've got a couple of questions. My first one is, in your book, have you considered anything for the regional areas? How do they connect in here? And what, if you haven't, what would you give us on face value now on what the regions can do?
Yeah.
And the second part is, how does the format of government change to include community engagement and citizen engagement in the next part of the technology revolution?
Yeah. Well, they're two great questions, Daniel. And obviously, for as long as people have thought creatively about technological change, a big part of their thinking has been, what does this mean for decentralisation? What does it mean if you have the technological infrastructure? What does it mean for the economies of some of these places, far away from capital cities? And we do a little bit of that book, but probably, could do with more of that sort of thinking. For as long as I've been involved in politics, about 20 years now, people have talked about, in X years' time, everyone will be working from home and all of these sorts of things. And there are other people who are experts on this in this room. But what people are discovering is people like the social interaction of work, and so there's more of a hub model than a working from home model developing. But that doesn't mean that those hubs can't be in regional areas. And as our cities become more and more crowded, as people are looking for more and more opportunities to live in beautiful places like the Southern Highlands, that can only be an opportunity for you. In terms of engagement with the community, a lot of the things that we're talking about today are sort of beyond the simple established channels that people rely on now. I rely on social media like all of the elected representatives do here. This is really a next level kind of a thing, and I'm not aware of, when you think of artificial, machine learning and artificial intelligence and all that sort of thing, I'm not aware of any big developments there in terms of the job that I do. But if people are aware of any of them, obviously we're all ears. Tracy.
Don't look so worried.
I just think it's weird how you need a microphone to speak to me a metre away. And then,
It's innovative.
So my question's in regards to the flipped learning.
Yeah.
I think that is an awesome idea. But you know that I'm very passionate about the fact that the education system needs to put life skills back in there. Because I'm dealing with the cohort 19 and above. When someone doesn't know how to do a budget, are you serious? And being able to educate them in one day totally changes a life. So
you shouldn't be too unfair to them. Scott Morrison doesn't know how to do a budget either.
Walked into that one. No, so do you think the flipped learning, because I think that's such an innovative idea. I mean, I know of a school in Logan who, 7 years ago, introduced tablets for their Year 7 students when they went to middle school. And I thought it was personally a great idea. We could go on holidays and my child could GPS into the classroom to still do work. I know that hasn't seemed to have taken off everywhere. I don't know if it was a cost thing.
It's a cost thing, yeah.
Okay, yeah. But I think the flip learning is awesome. But I think the curriculum needs to have some of the life skills and / social skills that are needed to survive in today's world.
Yeah. That's an outstanding point, Tracy. And the reason why I agree with that so much is because when you think about the things that machines can't do, judgment, some of the judgments, interpersonal judgments, some of the caring industries, some of the decision-making that societies rely on, that's really what we need our kids who are graduating from school to have those sorts of skills. And so nobody would recommend to you that computational thinking as a substitute for some of these life skills that you mentioned. They're absolutely crucial, probably more crucial in the machine age than ever before. The thing about the iPads, and without naming schools, one of the things I've noticed, I've got 43 schools in my electorate, and one of the things that I've noticed is, and some of the colleagues here would have noticed it as well, is the extraordinary difference in the type of aspirations that kids have after they've had access to decent technology or no access to decent technology. And there's a school in my electorate where at their graduation ceremony for their grade 6 kids, they put up on a screen behind us as we're handing out the certificates and shaking hands and getting the photos taken. They put up on the screen behind us what that kid's aspiration is, and what was the best thing that happened to them while they were at school. And what this school has is it has one class with laptops, and you apply to be in the laptop class, and you win the opportunity to be in the laptop class, and the other class doesn't have laptops. And it's an extraordinary experiment. In lots of ways, it makes me sad actually when I think about it. Nothing against the school; they're doing the best that they can with the resources that they have. But what you notice is the non-laptop class. What do you want to be when you leave school? I want to play in the NRL or whatever, nothing wrong with that. I'd like to play in the NRL too. And what was the best day that you had at school? Might be anything. The other class, what do you want to be when you leave school? Coders, all these really ambitious, technologically focused jobs. What was the best day that you had at this school? The day that I found out I was in laptop class, right? And that goes to the point that you were making at the end about resources and iPads and all that sort of thing. And this is one of the many reasons why we need genuine needs-based funding in our schools. And we need to pay particular attention to the schools where the idea of a family buying, 5 iPads for 5 kids is not within reach.
I have one more question just out of front. Thank you.
Just carrying on with the idea from education and politics and life skills. I was at a think tank with local government Queensland a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things that was suggested was educating our children to choose politicians. So in a life skill, we still choose politicians by name, by face, by personality, yet politicians are the ones that make policy. Politicians are the one that shape the future. Politicians are the one that people have, your lives depend on a politician's decision. So how do we go about educating our children to choose the best decision maker into the future? And that part of the curriculum is just completely missing.
It's a really great question to finish on, Rachel. One of our recommendations in the book goes to how people engage in civic life, because that's obviously something that you can't leave to others or to machines, and so it's an important thing. In terms of educating people to make a good decision, I hope I don't offend Oscar when I say that we should start with the Americans, who've just made an extraordinary choice over there. But I don't have a great answer to that. I'm being flippant because I don't have a great answer to it. Obviously, some of the best things that we teach our kids about in school is about civic life and encouraging them to think about and be a part of something bigger than themselves, and that's the way that their community is engaged and the way that it's run. And we encourage them, and all of the political people here, I'm sure, I encourage people to get involved, even if it means getting involved in the opposite side of politics, to me. But beyond that, that's really something that other people would have a better sense of, and teachers and others. It's a bit hard from where I sit to know how we do that best. But it's obviously crucial in the machine age that we choose the kind of leaders who care about the sorts of issues that we're talking about today. Thanks very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was an amazing session. I think we all can take a lot away from that. And of course, the book is still forthcoming, so if that didn't whet your appetite, then I don't know what will. I'm looking forward to it myself, and of course, lots of Christmas stocking fillers there, no doubt about it. But it does lead us to a few important points that perhaps we've touched on today, but haven't been brought out so fully, and that one of the key principles of technology, digital and smart cities is that technological disadvantage or digital disadvantage can reinforce existing social disadvantage or existing social exclusion. We need to take that very seriously. And that leads us to the next question, the corollary or the consequence. What is the role of education and redistribution in adjusting and modifying and taking that into account? Also, I think the Honourable Dr. Jim Chalmers also mentioned something very interesting, which really isn't an important part of the debate in Australia at the moment, is how we're going to innovate GDP. The basic measure of welfare, and has been for many, many years, but all economists know that it's a broken measure, yet we still continue to push it forward, and it is leading to all sorts of perverse outcomes. So if we talk about innovation, let's start innovating the big things. Let's not think about the small things. And I do like that story about the children and their laptops. I know that's exactly the same for my children. When they get their laptops, they are so excited at school. And it does make me think of our counterparts in Lima. Not as developed as we are in Australia, not as lucky as we are in terms of wealth and opportunity. However, they understand the possibilities of digital and technology, and in their schools they're doing cool things like teching out old shipping containers and allowing their kids to engage with technology where they can. They move them around, give them opportunities. So just those little things and thinking creatively can allow us to do something different. And as I said before, look, the book is going to be fantastic. I am definitely going to read this one, so thank you, Dr. Jim Chalmers, thank you so much. Let's round of applause again, thank you. Really good.